Hello. It's the German views on the Treaty of Versailles. Now, this has got to be put in context with what happened at the end of the war. Germany lost. That much is simple. Why did they lose and how did they lose? Because it has a massive effect on the way that the treaty goes down in Germany. First of all, the Americans joined in 1917. With that and other reasons, including a naval blockade of Germany by the British Navy, meant that Germany were losing and their population was being starved, which led to protests and riots and socialist revolution in Germany, which in the future led to this idea that the Germans had been stabbed in the back by the communists that Hitler so often propounded. Now, Ludendorff was one of their main generals, and in 1918 he tried one last throw of the dice to try and get a military victory. Remember, at no point had the Germans been invaded. France had, Belgium had, various other countries had, but the Germans had not been invaded. And they'd also beaten Russia on one front. And all this was told to the German population in propaganda. We're winning. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, Ludendorff pushed on very successfully in 1918. Took a lot of ground, almost got through to Paris. Had he done so, it might have been a totally different story, and this module might have been called something completely different. But they failed, and it was the last throw of the dice. And because it failed, the German army had no resources to launch another attack similar to the Ludendorff plan, the final push. German people didn't know this. As far as they were concerned, they were still winning the war. However, because of the revolutions and riots in Germany, and because the Kaiser was forced to abdicate in November, and because the Germans believed they would get a soft peace with the 14 points, they signed the armistice on the 11th of November. The German people could not believe it. They, like Hitler, were disgusted. But they were hoping for a soft peace based on the League of Nations. So imagine their surprise when they realised they were not going to be involved in the peace process. And they were not invited to the Treaty of Versailles. But it got worse when they actually were handed the terms of the treaty. Every single clause they went through and pretty much said, we don't like that, we don't agree with that. But because the British naval blockade was still starving their population and the German army was not ready to fight again, they couldn't do anything about it. So they had to accept. And the men who accepted were the Weimar Republic's newly elected first ever democratic government, which was not a good start for them, and they were called the November Criminals. And it was also them who'd stabbed Germany in the back. The peace was called a diktat because it had been dictated to by the three big powers, the Allies, Britain, France and America. And what else is there with the Treaty of Versailles and the German? Yes, whatever whatever the peace would have been, the Germans would not have accepted it because they did not accept truly that they'd lost the war. So that was part of the problem, not as much the terms, because at the end of a war so great, the terms were always going to be harsh. They'd imposed the same terms on Russia when they beat in Russia, a very harsh peace in the Brest-Litovsk treaty with Russia, and they would have probably done exactly the same to Britain and France had they won. It's this idea that the Germans never truly accepted that they didn't win, they lost the war, which is one of the reasons a lot of historians say that Versailles was so unpopular. There's also the fact that some of the right-wing groups in the early 20s used the Treaty of Versailles as a handy scapegoat to further their own ends, to pursue their own agenda, which was revolution and rebellion and putschs, to try and overthrow this new democratic Weimar government.